How are you, Rabbi?
Very well. Good to see everybody.
Good.
Good to see you all. So we're going to continue with our study of where can wisdom be found. And what I'd like to do is today for us to look at chapter 9. And everybody has their chapters in front of them, I assume. So with that in mind, we'll go through the chapter and then we'll see what emerges here. Again, moving through 7 and 8, it's interesting for us to now consider what's emerging here in this specific chapter and how does it relate to the larger program and curriculum that is being promulgated by the author of Mishlei. So let's take a look at that now together, and I'll go around the room and we'll each get a chance to read maybe 3 or 4 verses. Yeah, let's say 4 verses each. Okay, so chapter 9. Chochmot banta bait chatzva amodeha shiva. Shirley.
Wisdom has built her house. She has hewn out her 7 pillars.
Just going to make sure it's available for those that don't have it. So we're on chapter 9 here. Okay, tavcha tivcha mascha yeina af orcha shulchana.
She has slaughtered her meat, mixed her wine, also laid out her table.
Shalcha na'aroteha tikra al gape merome karet.
She has sent forth her maidens, calls out from the city heights.
Mi feti yasur hena chasar lev amra lo.
Whoever the dupe, let such a person turn aside here. As for the senseless, she said to him.
Okay, Morton, we're going to continue. If you join me on 5, lechu lachamu belachami ushtu beyain masachti.
Come, eat of my bread and drink the wine I have mixed.
Azvu petaim vechiyu veishru b'derech bina.
Forsake foolishness and live, and walk in the way of discernment.
Yoser letz lokeach lo kalon umochiach lerasha mumo.
Who reproves the scoffer takes on disgrace. Who rebukes the wicked is maimed.
Al tochach letz pen yisa'anecha hochach lechacham v'ya'avecha.
Rebuke not a scoffer, lest he hate you. Reprove the wise, and he will love you.
Great. Okay, Bev, do you want to take 9? Ten lachacham v'yechkam od hoda letzadik v'yosef lekach.
Give to the wise, he will be yet wiser. Inform the righteous, he will increase instruction.
Techilat chochma yirat Adonai v'dat kedoshim bina.
The beginning of wisdom is reverence of the divine, and knowing the Holy One is discernment.
Ki vi yirbu yamecha v'yosifu lecha shnot chaim.
For through me shall your days be multiplied, and the years of your life shall be increased.
Great. Okay, Alan on 12. Im chachamta lach ve'latzata levadcha tisa.
If you are wise, you get yourself wisdom. But if you scoff, you bear it alone.
Eshet ksilot homia patiyut uval yada ma.
Woman folly bustles about gullibility. She knows nothing of it.
V'yashva lefetach beita al kiseh meromei karet.
And she sits perched at the doorway of her house in a chair on the city's heights.
Okay, Marion 15. Likra leovrei darech hamesharim or chotam.
To call to them that pass
I just
by.
need to.
Can
Sorry,
you
you were muted before. Go ahead.
Is that okay?
Yep.
To call
Perfect.
to them,
Go ahead.
to call to them that pass by, who go right on their ways.
Mi feti asur hena v'chaser lev ve'amra lo.
Whoever is the dupe, let him turn aside here, and the senseless, she said to him.
Maim gnuvim yimtaku v'lechem starim yinam.
Stolen waters are sweet, and purloined bread is pleasant.
V'lo yada ki refaim sham be'imkei she'ol kru'eha.
And he knows not that the shades are there, that her guests are in the depths of the netherworld.
Okay, so this is an interesting chapter, and there are obviously some things that begin to emerge here. What are some of the themes or the issues that you noticed here that are different, that set it apart from the previous chapters, especially what we were seeing in terms of the patterns of 7 and 8, but anything else that you notice as well? So what are some of the things you want to draw our attention to, or that you're noticing, or maybe you have questions about? Yes, Alan.
Well, in chapter 9, the description of the female woman is now quite positive, whereas in previous 2 chapters, wisdom or alternative wisdom was looked on as some kind of seduction that could only have bad consequences.
Okay, so you're seeing the alternate form of wisdom as being less negative here?
Correct.
Interesting. Does everybody agree with that? I see what you're pointing out. I'm not sure if everybody agrees. Is that the case in terms of the other side of the coin? As we're looking at these, the light side, the dark side, this binary that's set up, Alan's saying that the other side is less negative this time. Does everybody agree with that? And maybe take a look and see specifically where you see that in the text itself. I want to see how you defend that in the text.
Well, wisdom here is for opening line. Wisdom is building a house on 7 pillars, and I understand the symbolism of 7 pillars is something that in ancient architecture made a house very strong.
Okay.
And then the hospitality of bringing people into the house. There is it's less pejorative about alternative wisdom than it was in the other 2 chapters.
Okay, less pejorative doesn't mean that it's not negative, but yes, maybe it is less pejorative. So what do you think is what's going on here? Why is this happening?
The writer is acknowledging the power of this, new wisdom.
And where do you see that as being acknowledged as less pejorative? So we have the 7 pillars, but that's for wisdom. So show me where in the text you see this as being, you haven't said that it's positive, but you're saying it's less pejorative. So show me where.
There's compared to the other 2 chapters, there are no negative consequences of following her wisdom. In fact, there's...
what about verses 17 and 18, though?
I never made the connection between my original impression and the last few sentences. As a matter of fact, the more I go on into the sentences, the more I don't understand where this is going.
Okay, well, that's fair because it is a bit elliptic, but you were talking about Lady Folly. I called her Wisdom Folly, but I decided to change her name to Lady Folly and as opposed to Woman Wisdom as the 2 kind of sides of the coin. But Eshet Ksilut Homia, she bustles about in verse 13. Patiyut Uval Yadama. She knows nothing of gullibility, but she's sitting perched at the doorway of her house in a chair on the city's heights. And what is she doing from 13 onwards that the chapter again is trying to alert the disciple about? You're right, it is another pathway, and unfortunately it doesn't seem to end well because we end up back in Sheol. You don't want to be in Sheol, right? The depths of the netherworld.
Yes.
Isn't she's luring in the naive again?
That's right. That's right. But I think, Alan, what you're noticing something that is interesting enough to think about is that it feels a little bit less pejorative. There's something, maybe the sting is gone from the first time because it was so offensive and so shocking in the first chapters that we saw. Maybe the sting is wearing off. I'm not sure, but you are touching on to something, but still there is a sense of being lured, and it leads, this time it's not to death, but it's to the netherworld, Sheol, which is usually the doorway to death. So, okay, we've noticed that. What else do people notice, Marion?
I have a question, Rabbi, about the verb tense, because
Yep.
in the last chapter, wisdom is described as the companion of creation, that
Yes.
she delight.
She's the plaything, Sha'ashua. She's the Oman, the nursling, the architect.
Yes, exactly.
Right? Right. The co-creator, we said.
Yes, and here
Right.
in the first 5, there's a shift in emphasis and shift in description of wisdom herself, because everything is in the past accomplished tense. Her house is built.
Yes, that's right. That's right. Very good. So what does that mean, Marion? Now it's past. So what are we looking at in chapter 9 that's different than chapter 8? That's a very good observation. What's the difference?
So that in chapter 9, it seems like we're talking about a different time in which we must, that our gaze is refocused to the here and now in which wisdom is established.
That's right.
Something still in motion with creation.
Right. We're no longer in primordial time. We are in something like human or mundane time or calendar time, or we talked last time a little bit about, remember, about Chronos and the creation of time in the Greek myths. And it's not really, it's not explicit, but Marion noticed it in the verb tenses, which shows us that it's a different, if you were casting this as a movie and you were showing time periods with different colors, the primordial time maybe was sepia tone, and now this is in technicolor, we could say. Maybe that's what's going on. But there is something that's happening, and it makes us, again, also think about the Eshet Chayil who is going to be coming, who has done a lot of similar things to what wisdom has done here. And it's a little bit strange because Lady Wisdom here, or Woman Wisdom, is called chokhmot and not chokhmah, and I haven't been able to discern why it is that now it's in the plural. I have to go do some more critical research to see what's really going on here, because it's strange. I would have expected it to say chokhmah banta beita, but it says wisdom's plural has built her house, which is, it's a strange locution. So I'm not sure how to really comment on that. But the welcoming house with the 7 pillars that Alan is referring to, why is 7 important, aside from whether or not, if you look at Vitruvius and some of the earlier Greek and Roman structures, I'm not sure they always use 7 to build their houses and to build temples. Architecturally, I don't think you necessarily need 7 to make something sturdy. But what is the meaning of the fact that she has created her house from 7? Why is that important in a Jewish or Hebraic context? What could that be pointing to? And it goes, yeah, go ahead, Martin.
7's a holy number.
Why?
Well, the 7 days of creation, or the 6 days of creation plus Shabbat.
Right, and that's important because of what Mariam was referring to, is going back to chapter 8, we were focusing on co-creation. So we were in primordial time before there was Bereshit, before there was chapter 1 of Genesis, before there were the 7-day cycle that you just alluded to, Morton, in terms of Bereshit. So now, again, in parallel, this could be, like Shabbat. Maybe this is like the 6th or the 7th day of creation. She's built her house, the floor plan that was required. We saw, the intimate interactions, in the process of imagining and designing the schematics of what existence would look like in the world. And now, as Marion pointed out, because of the tense change, we see we are now in real time, or in live time, where we're back on the earth. We're not in the primordial celestial realm, and there is a house that has been built. So the creation cycle and the symbolism of the 7 is obviously important, in that regard, because it reminds us of the story of the creation of the world. And here, this is the instruction for the creation of wisdom, and how wisdom becomes manifest through a house. Now, is this necessarily a physical house? Perhaps, as Alan said, it could be. One second, Alan. But what else could the seven columns also be referring to? Look at the architecture of the whole text itself. Where are we now in that architecture of the text of Proverbs? Marion?
Could it not be all the dimensions in which the seven pillars can refer to the different dimensions in which the divine resonates? Because we're talking about the beginning of wisdom as the reverence of the divine. And she's talking about her house, her architecture, the house that has been built on the seven pillars.
Mm-hmm.
Are we talking about, I don't know whether it's from our perspective or from the divine's perspective, but maybe it's, I don't know, but that the seven pillars refer to directions and to ways of perception. Is that?
It could be. That's one possibility. We don't have the iteration of that as yet that we've seen, but it could be that it's coming. So that might be what's in store. What else, Shirley? What do you think?
So I'm wondering if it's a reference to the previous chapters, although this
It
is
could be.
chapter 9. I was trying to figure out, is one doubled or like the first one is the introduction and then.
Yeah, I think there's a really strong possibility that maybe the first chapter is the introduction, and then 2 through 8 are the seven pillars. That's very possible. Or we could look towards the rest of the book and try to see where are the main kind of, like, not just chapter headings, but where are the main clusters gathered in terms of each of the main themes that we're seeing. And that may be what Marion is talking about, is that there are these different aspects or qualities that we're seeing in throughout the whole book, and maybe that is those are the themes, and we should keep our eyes open and try to remember that maybe the plan of the book is not just according to chapters, but maybe there's 7 clusters and 7 themes that are recurring that Miriam was pointing to. We have to keep track of that. We have to go back over 1 through 8 and then go forward as we're doing this, and just keep a constant tally and say, maybe there's 3 chapters that fit into one pillar, and another 4 chapters that fit into another pillar, right? We have, some things that deal with character development and character refinement. We have a pillar that maybe deals with cosmic consciousness. We have a pillar that deals with woman wisdom. We have a pillar that deals with woman folly. We have, what the house looks like that the Eshet Chayil creates. We probably could come up with 7 pillars that seem to give us the overall structure of the book. And then the chapters really become a little bit more incidental, but maybe there's a larger architecture of the way the book is planned that is moving back and forth. So we don't just read it chronologically, which we're trying to do now, but after we've gone through it, we say, let's just take each chapter out and see where we can fit it into these 7 pillars, as if we were building and we saw the floor plan rather than just reading it chapter by chapter. So I think it's something that we're going to keep an ongoing tally of, and see if it's consistent as a way of giving like these larger pillars, or like a meta organizational principle, sort of like files on your computer. Like there's going to be files within, we're going to have files, and then we're going to have in the files you'll have documents, and the documents are like the chapters, but the pillars are like the files. So we have to figure out what are the 7 files that make up this whole program. Let's keep that in mind as we go through it. So go ahead, Alan. Sorry, you've been patient.
I have this sense that there somewhere in our Talmudic studies there are 7 attributes that describe a pious or wise Jew, and I'm just throwing this out there because the word 7 pillars seems to be something I've heard before, but I don't know where. There's something symbolic about it as having great significance. Philosophically, as there are 7 attributes that maybe a Jew has to follow. When they wrote the biography of Lawrence of Arabia, where he wrote it was called The Seven Pillars. Something about the number seven and the word pillars seems to be part of our culture, and I can't put my finger on it.
No, you're onto something, Alan, and I've refrained from jumping forward from ancient Israelite text to medieval Kabbalah, because in medieval Kabbalah, it's very concerned with the seven and the three that make 10, and these are spheres of ethical refinement or divine consciousness that the mystic tries to cultivate. But I'm refraining from going there because I want to try, before we make that jump, and then that jump also can happen in a parallel fashion, what's going on in the ancient Near East. Let's try to first understand it in the axial age context, right? So if we're looking for it, rather than making the first jump into ethical literature, which is a good intuition that you have, if we're looking at it just on the line in terms of what Judaism has to say, seven develops in a certain way. But let's also look at it, in this way, on this sphere as well, horizontally across the axial age, and look at parallel cultures to see the role that seven plays in terms of structuring the cosmos and character refinement. So whether we would be looking at Buddhist or Confucius, Taoist texts or Indian texts to see if there's anything there, that might be a hint. And then also looking through the rest of the Bible, aside from what Morton mentioned about Genesis 1, if you were to do a full survey of the use of the number seven in the Hebrew Bible, look at the way that it's used in different contexts, because perfect numbers in the ancient Near East, there's a lot of them. There's 7, there's 10, there's 40. There's a series of numbers that are considered to be perfect numbers. And there's been a lot of studies that on the symbolism of numerology in the ancient Near East that requires us to do further reflection before we jump forward into the Talmudic period, which is the 2nd to the 6th century CE, as you're referring to, and then the advent of ethical literature, let's say from the 9th to the 13th century, which is more medieval, and then into Kabbalah from the 13th century to the 16th century. So I'm resisting going there, even though it's hard to refrain and to resist it. But you're right, you can hear it. It's resonating because it's very important within the parallel developments of Jewish ethical literature called Musar, as well as Kabbalah. 7 is super important about those spheres of development and refinement of character that become also known as midot, right? These are qualities of what we would today, and in Yiddish parlance would say, of what it is that makes a mensch, right? What does it mean to become a refined human being? So we've got all these accretions, but I'm just trying to as an archaeologist, I'm just trying to wipe away all the layers, and let's just try to look at the first layer of the Ur text, and then we'll go and we'll jump forward. But for now, let's try to stay in ancient Israel. And I invite you for next week, for those that want to look further, look back at the Jaspers article that I sent you about the axial age. And if you see other parallels and within cultures of that time, let's see the way other cultures looked at 7 to see why what Proverbs is doing is different. What's unique about this approach to 7 that makes this Jewish rather than a universal approach to a perfect number? Because the Babylonians and the Assyrians and the Mesopotamians, they also had, and the Greeks, they had different ways of looking at perfection through numbers, and those were really significant and important. So on the one hand, it's not unique to the Israelite tribe. On the other hand, we're trying to do something with this material to say this is what makes it part of our tribal identity. So what's unique about this and what's universal about it? I'm leaving it as an open question because I at this point we have to just do more work on it. I want to just spend a little bit of time on something else that I find intriguing, and it picks up on what Alan was referring to in verse 10. This is a very important verse. It has a quite an afterlife within ethical literature as well as within the Siddur. The different versions of it, we're going to see it later in Proverbs as well. Either it says Tchilat Chochma or it says Reshit Chochma. For example, this becomes the name of a book, the beginning of wisdom. What is the beginning, the origins of the beginning of wisdom? Yirah. We have to talk a little bit about what this means. But just so you know, again, going to what Alan was referring to, Elijah Davidas wrote a very important book, I believe in the 16th or 17th century, called Reshit Chochma, which was very much inspired by what the curriculum that is implied here in the book of Proverbs, and it's a book that is dedicated to ethical refinement. What does it mean to be an ethical human being as a Jew? What does the curriculum look like in the 16th, 17th century? So Davidus wrote a book called Reshit Chochmah, which is devoted specifically to that work. We're not going to look at it, but I'm just saying another resonance of the afterlife of just a few of these words are very important. So we're going to see it. Let's pay attention to how many times we see this reference to where wisdom begins, okay? Not just in primordial time, but more importantly, she's built a house. And now how do we manifest this in our lives in terms of character refinement? So the teacher is saying to the disciple, the first step that you need to take in order to be able to enter into this curriculum is Yirat Adonai. So what is Yirat Adonai? We've talked about Yira a few times together, and then Dat Kadoshim is Bina. We'll get to that in a few minutes. But Yirat Adonai, Yira can be translated in a number of ways, and Yira specifically can refer to, as we've said before, it refers to fear or reverence. It depends on whether it is that sense of Yira, Yirat Schar V'Onesh, right? That is the fear of just desserts or of reward and punishment. So that's a certain kind of yira. And then there's also another kind of yira, which I tend to always go to, and that's my bias, because I tend to respond to the sense of yirat haromamut, which is radical amazement and reverence. So both of them are implied, depending on the context of how you're reading it. But here, there's something about the process of forming one's identity as a disciple here with the teacher, and a sense of self, where the role of awe and reverence is critical in terms of the relationship that the disciple, the student, has with the teacher. So for those of you that have spent your life teaching, you may have a different perspective, and I want to hear from you. What have you felt has been the effective relationship that you've been able to cultivate with your students? Take a moment and let me just pause here, and I want to call on you to see what you want to share. So who wants to share for a moment what that may have been for you in your life, an effective teacher-student relationship? If we're talking about Yira, how would you translate it in your experience? You may choose a different word, but I'm saying in the context of what's being discussed here, what have you seen as being effective, either as a student or a teacher? Yeah, Marian.
I studied in San Francisco before moving to Canada, and it was the first time that I heard students speak directly to their professor and call them by their first name instead of by their title, and sometimes even refer to other professors, by their last name as a sort of slang instead of saying Professor so.
Professor.
Yes.
Right. Yeah.
And
so what was that like?
It was very unnerving. I'm still very uncomfortable with it. It seems so disrespectful. And I wondered sometimes when I'm speaking with the professors themselves in private, they often talked about how difficult it was in this day and age to actually teach, that people's attention.
Because so what was missing, Marian? That's a very harif example, but so what's missing in that relationship that would have maybe been rectified by this curriculum?
Well, I mean, to just say respect is something that it's difficult to convey to someone if they don't come from a culture of respecting their teachers or their elders. But
right.
Something as small as the professors would insist that that the students want to be listened to. It's not good enough for me to just lecture now and to have them be happy listening to me. All of a sudden, the student has the right to be heard. So I have to break up my class. Instead of really illuminating the text and showing what's most important and taking all my time on that, I have to break it down and ask the students' opinions. And it was a shift in technique and a shift in hierarchy as well.
Yes, well, it's definitely a challenge to hierarchy, and that's a whole kind of zeitgeist that is interesting. But to go back to the question that you answered and to think about it further, here it doesn't use the word kavod. It doesn't say Reshit Chochma Kavod Adonai, which it could say, because kavod is something that is throughout the Hebrew Bible. We talk about the Ananeha Kavod, and that kavod, the divine glory, moves in different ways and is understood in different ways. It's not what's being used here, but it's saying yirah. So what other ways could we inculcate a sense of, again, returning to or reevaluating the importance of hierarchy? Here there is a hierarchy between master and disciple. There clearly is. And the description of what you're talking about, I think many of the teachers that are here have probably experienced that in university settings or otherwise, where there has been a shift, a generational shift in terms of those assumptions of hierarchy. What about other teachers here who want to reflect on their years of teaching? Or not? They must be very wise because they're remaining silent. You have to unmute. Bev?
Okay. I'm not thinking about it the way Marion is. It's reverence for the subject matter. Okay, so in this case, we're talking about the divine, but if I'm teaching, I wanted to impart the fact that there's value in the subject and that it's a stepping stone for other things, and that you elevate yourself by having a certain amount of respect for the subject matter and moving on. So I'm the vehicle. I didn't see it the same way. I don't come from the same kind of background that Marion might have. We got used to calling professors by first names or prof so-and-so, but the reverence was for the to immerse yourself in the subject. Now, it isn't theology and it's not studying rabbinic texts and things of this sort, but it was a subject that I valued, and I wanted to transmit that value to students who were novices.
So how did you transmit that as a value, though, as a teacher?
Showing the relevance. I taught child psychology and introductory psychology, and then courses related to health and happiness. So it was improving the quality of your own life and other people's lives. So taking beyond the person to, okay, eventually you might have children, or eventually you'll go out in the world and be doing things for other people. So
so that has value.
That has value.
And therefore, by being the one who is channeling or acting as the vehicle for this, by extension, there is value added to the one transmitting, because it's not, I'm not sure, maybe you differ, you disagree, but is it possible to be able to value the subject matter and disrespect or not value the conduit of the knowledge itself, that is the teacher?
Yes, and I'll tell you what happened when
Okay.
I taught at a religious school for girls who were post-secondary.
Right.
And I was teaching child development, and it was probably the hardest thing that I ever did, because they just wouldn't accept science. And it was my grandmother says, or the Rabbi says, and I had to politely push back on that, but they weren't buying.
So that's a very interesting scenario that you're rubbing up against now. Is it's a much larger question that we have to reflect on when we talk about wisdom and chokhmah here. And in the ancient world, there was no distinction between religion and science, but in the modern world, when you're teaching students now, there is. And so when you come to bring the best of what they would call, just saying in the deeply ultra religious world, they call it chokhmat hagoyim, right? So secular knowledge, as opposed to our chokhmah, or the chokhmah of Sifrei Kodesh or the Rebbe. So they have a built-in reverence for religious leaders and the chain of tradition within religion. And so unless the Rebbe, and in this case, I think I hear you're probably talking about, if it was the late Lubavitcher Rebbe, then he actually he studied science. I'm not sure whether he finished his degree in engineering at the Sorbonne, but he was extremely aware of and made available to himself the best of medical knowledge and of science for the purpose of serving his religious community. And you see that in a lot of Hasidic communities, that the Rebbe becomes the conduit, and in a sense, kind of like the step down mechanism, right? So it has to filter through the Rebbe. And the reason why they're saying, well, we don't accept what you're saying because you're not the Rebbe. But if the Rebbe read the same book on child psychology about Winnicott or Adler or whatever, and it came through the Rebbe, then it's kosher, right? So
Exactly.
there's a channel for transmission that they're willing to accept. And the interesting question, so it's frustrating on the one hand as a teacher, because you're trying to teach the best and the most updated knowledge that you have in the world of critical studies and psychology, and obviously you're an expert as a teacher, and also keeping up on all the latest developments. But the challenge in that system of teaching is that it's frustrating because you're trying to impart this knowledge, but they don't trust the source of the knowledge, not because of you, but because it's coming from the outside world, and they are so inculcated with a sense of yirah. And in a girls setting, and for girls, it's probably a sense of fear. There's a lot of different social pressures and anxiety, but I would, again, I'm painting a broad stroke here, but in many of those communities, there is a deeper sense of fear and anxiety. For example, that you won't get a good shidduch if you don't conform to the way things look within the social norms. If you go and I'll give you an example. This is a good example of the same thing you're talking about, Bev. Rebecca Goldstein is an amazing philosopher. She came from an ultra-religious, or I think it was a fairly ultra-religious community, or an Orthodox community growing up, and she suddenly discovered Jewish philosophy. And so she was frustrated as a woman who wanted to learn, a girl becoming a woman. She wanted to learn all of the power and the depth of Jewish philosophy. And she was told, as I think probably in high school, that Spinoza was an Epicurus. And it was basically that kind of knowledge, and that knowing was considered to be heresy, and she wasn't allowed to study it, and it was dismissed. So if you read her phenomenal book, she ended up becoming a great American philosopher who happens to be Jewish. And she's a specialist in Spinoza. So her book, called Betraying Spinoza, is her struggle as a teacher and as a Jew. How do you integrate these two different forms of wisdom? It's an absolutely fascinating reflection. I highly recommend it. It's a very accessible read, even though Spinoza is not, but her book is. It's called Betraying Spinoza. And I think that actually really, it starts to hit the nail on the head in terms of, as moderns, what it is that that we struggle with. And I really I appreciate you sharing your experience in being in that environment. And I guess you would probably contrast that with teaching child psychology in a different setting. Let's say in a secular university, probably was less frustrating. There were probably other issues, but it was a little bit less frustrating because maybe there was less resistance to some aspect of what you were doing, right? But that resistance that you felt, it's interesting to see how it actually comes back to this question of how you define yira, and then how you create hierarchies based on yira. It's a very, very interesting question. So go ahead, Marion.
Sorry, Rabbi, in relation to that,
Yep.
I wonder if the monetizing of teaching has taken a lot of power or reverence away from the actual teacher itself. Because I had,
because students have to pay for it?
Yes, because I had an Indian professor who tried to kick a student out of her class, and she was reprimanded by the university. She said this student was very disrespectful, and the university said it doesn't matter. He paid, he has the right to be there.
Right. Yeah. No, I think that's a big part of it, and that's interesting. If you go into the medieval period, for example, just to address that, Maimonides, for example, suggests that a rabbi, to retain their integrity as a halachic decisor, should never be paid by the community. It's a different way of looking at it, but it's the issue of, if you look at the history of the monetization and the professionalization of the rabbinate, there are many halachic advisors who say that once you become a salaried employee of the community, you lose your ability to be able to be an objective legislator. And Maimonides, therefore, and his family was adamant that even though they held positions of great importance within the Egyptian community for many years, and sort of the rabbi the Jews would turn to all the world over, he himself and his children were all trained to be physicians, so they could earn a living somewhere else, and that they would not be affected by the professionalization of their craft. So it's interesting if we go back to Proverbs here and ask the question, the disciple who is now going and looking for the master, is there any sense of monetization here? Especially thinking about the fact that we talked about earlier in the axial age in general, and specifically when some of these texts seem to have appeared, there was that shift from agrarian society to a society where things were economized in terms of trading, in terms of the market. We see that the lure is the lure of the marketplace, and that's where alternative forms of wisdom are offered. But is there any contemplation of the temptation of the student to actually monetize and exchange money for wisdom? I don't know, but it's an interesting question. And you give an extreme example now where it's become so inverted that a student has more power over a teacher because they're paying for a service rather than having a transmission of knowledge, right? So it's a really interesting quandary. Let me throw one other thing into the mix here for us to think about. For next time, maybe someone can do a little bit more research on this. I'll give it to you as a challenge to look up the places in which the word yira appears in the Hebrew Bible, and to look at the specific clusters and to divide it up and to see where is yira used more of yirat Adonai as opposed to yirat Elohim. Here, it's yirat Adonai. Okay? I would like us to look at and to compare the places where the different name of God is used and what that could mean. I want to just give a preliminary possibility, but it needs to be investigated further. And for next time, maybe people will do a little bit of homework and see what you come back with. But it's clear that yira is all-encompassing. It's an all-encompassing term for some kind of reverence. And it's not clear whether it comes from a place of fear and trembling in the face of just deserts and punishment, or if it's radical amazement at the created world. Now, one of the things that is important to remember are two examples in Scripture that I draw your attention to. One of them is the case of Yirah in the story of Abraham, Avimelech, and Sarah. Remember this story that Abraham chastises Avimelech and says that there was when he has to say that this is my sister, not my wife. Remember that whole ruse that goes on? Go back and look at that story in Genesis, and let's see what is the implication when Abraham then later on chastises Avimelech and says there's no yirah in Gerar in terms of the way that you treated my wife or that you mistreated her, right? The issue is if Avraham was only forthright and honest and didn't create a ruse and told Avimelech that it was his wife and not his sister, then maybe Avimelech would have acted with yirat Elohim, as I believe is what the term is that's used there. So in that context, what does it mean to be forthright and to be honest? Maybe this is a lesson about how yira is misused in the case of Avraham, Avimelech, and Sarah. Look at that story and we'll talk about it next time. The other one to contrast it with that to me is a little bit more clear because I'm not 100% sure how it's being used in the story of Avraham and Avimelech, but it's much more clear to me in the story in Exodus of the Hebrew midwives. Now, remember the Hebrew midwives, the Me'aldot HaIvriyot in the opening sections of Exodus, they are called Shifra and Pua, and it says that specifically they were the ones who engaged in the first acts of civil disobedience against the decree of the Pharaoh to kill all of the Hebrew males because they had Yirat Elohim. So in that case, especially now, so let's say we have Avraham on the one side, and Sarah, who are the first Jews, or the first Hebrews, they're Ivriim, okay? If we go to the book of Exodus and we accept the hypothesis that the midwives were not Jewish or Hebrew, but that Shifra and Pua were specifically just the midwives who served the Hebrews. Okay, what does it mean for a non-Jew to have Yirat Elohim? What is it? What is it that Shifra and Pua are doing and displaying by engaging in an act of civil disobedience? How then would you say you would translate Yirat Elohim in that regard? What is it that they're displaying in their act of civil disobedience? What would you say it is that motivates them? They're not Jewish now, so what in this case, this test case? So what is it that motivates them, that underlies this Yirat Elohim, that tells them they can stand up to the decree of Pharaoh? What would that be translated as, Morton? What do you think that is?
Well, you could translate it either way. But if you're taking the assumption that they're not Jewish, then you're not going to say that they're worried about God's vengeance. But if they're midwives, you can imagine that they see the divine in the delivery of a child.
Definitely. It's just all I was saying is that you're touching on the distinction here for sure. A midwife knows intimately the inner workings of creation and the mystery of creation, absolutely. But by saying they're not Jewish, what we're doing is we're making a distinction here between Yirat Adonai, which is the fear of the particular tribal God of Israel, as opposed to Yirat Elohim, which is the universal sense of God. So between the universal and the particular, let's take it from the universal perspective. What would motivate someone like a midwife or someone who's working in, let's say, some kind of civil service for the government or for society to engage in an act of civil disobedience? What would the yira in that sense be if it's not to the tribal God of Israel? What would motivate them to do it?
Justice?
Maybe justice. So maybe yira could be justice. I don't think that's what it means here. I think it leads to the need for justice, but the motivation to see more justice in the world is to say that there is what's operating on a like sort of a more social, emotional, psychological level that's motivating someone to do what they did.
Well,
Bev?
Compassion?
it's
Maybe
understand-
compassion. Yeah.
Yeah,
Go ahead, Bev.
it's understanding the miracle of life and the miracle of creation. And it doesn't matter if you're not Jewish. There's something that links you with some divine source that has produced that miracle. And they're
Okay.
aware of that miracle by the work they do all the time.
So this awareness, so tell me, is it called awareness? Is that what the motivating factor is?
Reverence.
Awareness of the mystery, reverence. Okay, that goes back to reverence.
Right.
Okay. What else could it be? Marian?
But it has to be the recognition of a higher law than Pharaoh's law.
Okay.
It binds them in some way.
Okay, and so that gives us a sense perhaps of something like a basic integrity or a basic value of human life. It builds on what you're both saying. So a kind of basic, intrinsic integrity or a universal sense of honesty. Like when you feel something in your kishkas and this is the right thing to do. So Elisa said it's for justice, right? But there's something that motivates you to act in that way, to pursue it, to say that there's just a basic fundamental human right or a basic kind of integrity that every human being is due. And so because I am someone who is midwifing the human beings to come into the world, I understand intimately there's some kind of basic integrity to being human. And so that I will engage in this act of civil disobedience in order to be able to do that. So I'm leaving it really as something to something for everyone to think about for next week and to do a little bit of concordance work. Go through the Hebrew Bible in whatever way you can and find all the incidences of this expression of Yirat Adonai versus Yirat Elohim. Not just Yirah, but the way that it's actually spoken about here in Proverbs, because we're still not entirely clear as of yet. I just made a proposal and I'm waiting to see if it holds up in terms of the context of the Hebrew Bible. Is it the case that even though the curriculum until this point of Proverbs has appeared to be quite universal, that now the teacher is moving into a more tribal and particularistic approach to wisdom, that Yirat Adonai is particular to being an Israelite, as opposed to Yirat Elohim, which is more universal. So where the rubber hits the road now is now you have a classroom or you have a teacher-student relationship. Could a non-Israelite come to this teacher of wisdom and learn Yirat Adonai? Or could they cultivate a sense of Yirat Adonai to learn Chokhmah? Or if, let's say, Shifra and Pua, will just be achronological. Let's say Shifra and Pua came to this this curriculum and they wanted to study with this teacher, and they said, as a prerequisite, you have to have Yirat to come into this school. So if Shifra and Pua come in and they fill out the forms and they say, well, we have displayed that we, on our application, we have Yirat Elohim, would the teacher accept them? Or would they only be accepted if they had Yirat Adonai? So think about it. I don't know the answer, but I think it's a really interesting question for us to consider, because it's clear that the authorship of Proverbs knew the entire Hebrew Bible. So aside from looking at parallels in the axial age in terms of sevens and also in terms of Yira, which also exists in those cultures, like Marion was saying, this Indian teacher probably back in India could kick a student out of the class for being disrespectful, but then comes to San Francisco and is completely living in an inverted and teaching in an inverted world where there's no concept of Yira, actually it's inverted. The teacher is now afraid of the student because they're paying for class, that somehow they're going to affect enrollment. And if they don't have more than 5 students in the class, they're going to shut the course down. That's kind of the monetization of knowledge that's happened in some extreme cases in universities. So we're looking at all these different extremes. We've shared a couple reflections. So for next time, a couple things to do. First is to look at that incidence. And it's interesting if you do a tally, go through the whole Hebrew Bible. Someone can take on Yirat Adonai and someone can take on Yirat Elohim, and then bring it back and we'll see. You can talk amongst yourselves to see who wants to do what. I know Alan likes to make lists, so we'll see. Maybe he'll go through and work on it. But share it with each other and then bring it back with a full tally if we can, to see which one is more predominant in the Hebrew Bible and which one is particularistic to the tribe of Israel and which one is universal that anyone can engage in, whether or not they're officially part of the tribe. That's one thing. And then someone else maybe reading for enjoyment with all of your free time, to look at Rebecca Goldstein's book, Betraying Spinoza, and see whether or not she has any kind of Yirah, Adonai, Elohim, to be able to teach Spinoza and to remain a Jew. How could she do that as an Orthodox Jew? It's a fascinating question, building on Bev's really interesting anecdote of teaching in a Haredi school system. How do you teach psychology? So those are things for all of us to think about. For next time, we'll bring it back and we'll do a regroup on this part of chapter 9, and then we might go a little bit into chapter 10. But I think there's a lot of other things here that we have to pull apart, because we have reached that pillar, or at least we've reached the roadmap now. And also, please come back with your suggestions of what the 7 pillars are. We talked about that, saying that maybe the 7 pillars are chapters 2 through 8. That's what Shirley said, perhaps. Or the 7 pillars could be Eshet Chayil, woman wisdom, lady folly, cosmic consciousness, character development, and the prerequisites of being a disciple. I don't know, I'm putting it out there, but we have to come to terms with, by the end of the book, what are the 7 pillars that make this architecture of the text stand. Okay, so we have a lot of things that are ongoing assignments, and I'm sure we'll be able to each take a piece of